Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the anatomy and histology of the lungs. Okay, so we've now discussed the gross anatomy of the lungs, and we've also discussed the anatomy of the tracheobronchial tree. What I now want to describe to you is the histological structure of these different structures that we've discussed. So we're going to start off by discussing the histological structure of a bronchus. Then what we'll move on to is the histological structure of a bronchiole, firstly a conducting bronchiole, and then onto the smaller respiratory bronchioles, and then finally we'll go on to alveolar ducts and alveoli. Okay, so let's start off with a bronchus. I'm just wondering whether we're going to have enough space to do it here. I think I will move on to the next page to actually show you the histological structure of a bronchus. So, the way we're going to do this then is we're going to imagine that we have cut down a bronchus. So, if you imagine the tube like so, so here is a bronchus. What we are going to do is we're going to cut down like so, and we're going to have a look at the cut surface. We're going to take a cross section and we're going to have a look at the different layers of the bronchus wall. Okay, so a good place to start then is by drawing a circle, and we'll start off with the outermost layer of the bronchus wall, and an adjective meaning pertaining to the bronchus is bronchial, so I'll often say the bronchial wall. Okay, so here, this is going to be my picture then of our bronchial wall. So I've already told you about what the outermost layer then of the bronchial wall is actually going to consist of, and that's going to be the cartilage. Now, in a bronchus, you don't have a complete layer of cartilage around the outside. Instead, what you have is plates of cartilage in a connective tissue layer. So the layer is really a connective tissue layer with plates of cartilage in that connective tissue layer. Okay, so let me show you this. So here, this is going to demarcate the inner boundary of this connective tissue layer, and now let me put some plates of cartilage into here. So here, this can represent one of these plates of cartilage, like so. We'll have another one over here, like so, and then we'll have a third one down here, like so. And the gaps in between these plates of cartilage, they will be filled in with connective tissue that will connect the plates of cartilage together. So I'll just colour in the plates of cartilage then, here in blue, like so. And then we'll have the connective tissue that's in between the cartilaginous plates coloured in yellow. So these are the cartilaginous plates in this connective tissue layer, and as I said before, these are a distinguishing factor of the bronchi. This is what to look out for if you want to say that an airway is a bronchus, and bronchioles are not going to have this. And it gives support to the structure of the bronchi. It makes them very hard vessels that aren't going to collapse in the way that bronchioles do. Okay, so here, in yellow, this is the connective tissue that's in between the cartilaginous plates. So, just labelling everything up then, in blue we have cartilage. And I won't bother labelling up the connective tissue, I'll just have the cartilage labelled up. Okay, so what's the next layer in? So let's go down and inwards. So the next layer in is known as the submucosal layer, and it contains the submucosal glands. So I'll firstly just demarcate the inner boundary of this layer, and then I'll put some submucosal glands in. Now, most of the submucosal layer here is just going to consist of connective tissue, but amongst the connective tissue you're going to have the submucosal glands. So this layer is known as the submucosa or submucosal layer. So either of those two names is absolutely fine to use, submucosa, or you can call it the submucosal layer. So it's that portion there. So now let me, as I say, put some submucosal glands into the submucosa. Now, what does a submucosal gland actually look like? Well, firstly, let me just tell you what submucosal glands are actually going to do. They are going to be responsible for secreting mucus. Well, they're not solely responsible, but they play a huge part in secreting mucus onto the surface epithelium of the bronchus. And we'll talk about the function of the mucus later on. Now, they are effectively long tubes where the epithelium is capable of secreting the mucus, and these tubes are going to penetrate through the inner layers, the more inner layers of the bronchial wall to be continuous with the surface epithelium. And I'll talk about all of this later on once we've got the complete picture, because it's a very important thing to understand. But for now, understand that we're just going to be seeing cross-sections of these submucosal glands, and therefore they're going to look very boring. They're just going to look like this, little tubes, and we are looking at cross-sections of them, like so. They would be much longer, you see. We're just seeing a transverse cross-section effectively. We're seeing effectively the equivalent of what we're looking at here for the bronchus, for the submucosal gland. So again, we're not seeing this longitudinally, we're just seeing a cross-section of it. So it will be coming out of the page or going into the page effectively. Okay, so there is a submucosal gland, and all these consist of is these columnar epithelial cells here, which are responsible for secreting the mucus. So here's another one down here, and these columnar epithelial cells will just be on a basement membrane. So here is another one, and I think we'll call it quits once we've got 4 of them there. So these are representing the submucosal glands. Okay, right. So the submucosal layer then contains these submucosal glands, and I will discuss the submucosal glands more once we've put the additional layers of the bronchus on here. Okay, I think it's best to leave them aside for one moment, and then once we've got the complete picture, we'll come back to them. Okay, so let's go to the layer that's inner of the submucosal layer, so the layer inside the submucosal layer, and this consists of bronchial smooth muscle cells. So we're going to have a layer of smooth muscle cells which will form rings as our next layer. So this is the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, and I'll colour this in here in red. So these bronchial smooth muscle cells, of course, they can contract, and when they contract they will shorten in length, and when they all shorten in length, that will cause the rings to reduce in circumference, which will mean they also reduce in diameter, and therefore you get constriction of the bronchus lumen, so-called bronchoconstriction. So this layer here, this is the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer. And for short, I'll abbreviate smooth muscle cells down to SMCs. So S for smooth, M for muscle, C for cells. Okay, so that red layer there is the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer. Okay, now we're getting to the very inner parts now. So under the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, then what do we have? We have another layer of connective tissue known as the lamina propria, but on top of that we then have the actual epithelium, the surface epithelium of the airways, and I'm going to draw that before I add on the lamina propria, because the lamina propria is just the connective tissue layer in between the epithelium and the smooth muscle cell layer. So these are now going to be my epithelial cells. And the epithelial cells on the surface epithelium, like the epithelial cells of the submucosal glands, are going to be columnar epithelial cells. So that's a key word, so I'll just write it down here. So these are columnar epithelial cells, and I'll abbreviate ECs down, well, epithelial cells down to ECs here. Now, these surface epithelial cells, as well as being columnar, they are also ciliated. So they have cilia, which are these finger-like projections from their apical surfaces into the lumen. Now the columnar epithelial cells of the submucosal glands, those are not ciliated, they don't have cilia. So that's a difference between the columnar epithelial cells that are on the surface compared to those in the submucosal glands. And I'll discuss the fact that the submucosal glands are continuous with the surface epithelium in a moment, but that there is this change of these ones not having cilia. Okay, so here these are my columnar epithelial cells here, and I'll just add some feeble little cilia here, just as these lines. So this is my attempt to demonstrate the cilia, these finger-like projections from the apical surface of the columnar epithelial cells on the surface epithelium of the bronchi. Okay, now, what other structures do I want to add on to this picture then? Well, firstly I'll just highlight that word in there. But I also want to add on basement membranes. So remember, whenever you're talking about an epithelium, the epithelial cells will always be attached to a basement membrane. This is what keeps them in position. This is what stops them falling into the lumen effectively. This is the rigid protein meshwork that they're actually attached to, and which tells them where to be, holds them in place. So all of the submucosal glands, they will also have basement membranes, which the columnar epithelial cells are sitting on, like so. Okay, so those are the basement membranes, and they're just connective tissue. Major components of that are going to be collagen and also laminins. So these are the basement membranes, a meshwork of connective tissue that the epithelial cells are sitting on. Now then, that layer in between the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer and the basement membrane of the surface epithelium, then, that's going to be connective tissue. And here I can now just colour in all the bits of connective tissue that I've missed off. So remember, in the submucosal layer, amongst the submucosal glands, this is all just connective tissue, so I'll colour it in yellow here. And then this layer here, in between the basement membrane and the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, this is connective tissue as well. And this layer is known as the lamina propria. So this connective tissue between the basement membrane and the bronchial smooth muscle cell there, it's called lamina propria. Okay, right, so there we go. There are all the different layers of a bronchus. Now, let me come back to the submucosal glands and the production of mucus. So, you have a mucus layer on top of the columnar epithelial cells on the surface of the bronchus, and I'll just show this in green, the classical colour to show mucus. So on top of the cilia of the surface epithelial cells you have a mucus layer, so this is representing mucus here. Now this mucus is really important. This takes part in something known as the Mucociliary escalator, which is a really important part of the innate immune system. This is the way in which, well, it's one of the major ways in which you keep your airways and indeed your alveoli clean. You stop all of the horrible dust and particulate matter and bacteria that you're breathing in the air from the environment actually staying there permanently. So the idea is then that as you breathe in the air, which might have loads of dust and particulate matter and bacteria in, all of that bad stuff will get caught in the mucus of the airways, and indeed all the bronchi and indeed all of the conducting bronchioles are going to be covered in this mucus, which is going to be very sticky. So then of course we need to get this mucus out of the airways. It's no good just trapping the dirt in it and then it's sitting there forevermore. So what then happens is the cilia, they all sort of gradually beat, and they beat in such a way that the mucus is moved upwards and outwards. So it moves it in the direction that is the direction outwards. So up towards the trachea basically, so up to bigger airways and bigger and bigger and bigger airways, and then gradually up to the trachea, up the trachea, through the larynx, and then it's going to be swallowed down the laryngopharynx into the esophagus, and then it will go down to the stomach, and of course in the stomach it will burn and burn. Okay, so that's a major mechanism by which you actually keep your airways clean, and also of course your alveoli clean, because it means that the air that's actually going to get to the alveoli isn't going to have as much bad stuff in it, because most of it will have ended up in the mucus of the airways as it was getting towards the alveoli. Okay, and indeed in people with cystic fibrosis, this system breaks. In cystic fibrosis, and I'll just write this down here, so cystic fibrosis is a very famous genetic disorder, and what it results in is an inability to produce good mucus. You produce far too sticky mucus in cystic fibrosis. The mucus becomes incredibly sticky, incredibly viscous, too viscous, and it means that now the cilia can't actually move the mucus up. It's so sticky it just stays where it is, and that means that all of the bad stuff that you breathe in, it does get caught in this incredibly sticky mucus. I mean, the mucus is fantastic at catching the bad stuff, but of course if you can't actually clear the mucus, then the bad stuff just remains inside your airways, and this leads to horrendous chest infections. So cystic fibrosis, the mucociliary escalator breaks and you get horrendous chest infections. So that's how important the mucociliary escalator is as part of your innate immune system for keeping the lungs free of infection. I mean, it's an incredibly simple concept, far simpler than, for instance, all of that stuff that you can learn about T cells and their mechanisms, but it does the job so effectively at keeping your lungs free of infection. Okay, right, it's far more important in keeping your lungs free of infection than your T cells are. Right, not to undermine the importance of T cells, they're very important too, but this is so much more simple than T cells, and yet it's so effective. Right, so where was I? So I was going to talk then about where the mucus is actually produced. Now, the mucus is produced by the submucosal glands, but also by the surface epithelium itself. So, to produce mucus, there are two stages. Firstly, you have to produce what's known as a serous secretion, and then you have to add to this serous secretion lots of things which turn it into a mucus. So the classic protein that you add to it to turn it from a very non-viscous solution to a viscous, sticky solution is the protein mucin. So, let me explain what is a serous secretion. So, a serous secretion is just a secretion which is going to be isotonic to the extracellular fluid. So, it will consist of water and salt, and as I say, it will be isotonic to the extracellular fluid, to the interstitial fluid, and also to the blood plasma. So it's majorly just going to consist, though, of water and salt. So it's not very viscous at all, it's low viscosity. To turn that serous secretion into something that's sticky, a very high viscosity fluid, you have to add lots of things to it. And one of the principal things that is added is this protein known as mucin. Okay, so the normal columnar epithelial cells of the surface epithelium, these are capable of producing the serous secretion. You need special cells known as goblet cells to produce the molecules that are going to turn the serous secretion into a mucus. So amongst the serous secreting normal columnar epithelial cells, you'll have some goblet cells, and I'll colour these in green. So let's say that's a goblet cell. They wouldn't have cilia. In the ideal picture, they wouldn't have cilia, but unfortunately I've given all of these cells cilia, so I can't really retract that now. But the goblet cells wouldn't be ciliated. So amongst the normal columnar epithelial cells which are ciliated and which produce the serous secretion, you're going to have these special cells which are quite rare, called the goblet cells, which are going to secrete these molecules that turn the serous secretion into a mucus secretion. Now that's very capable of producing mucus, however it doesn't produce enough mucus. So we now have these special invaginations, effectively, of the surface epithelium, which are the submucosal glands, and these epithelial cells, they don't have cilia, but they're still capable of creating the serous secretion. And then amongst those cells, you'll have goblet cells. So I'll colour a few of these in green here. So these ones here, these are the rare cells, the goblet cells, amongst the columnar epithelial cells which secrete the serous secretion, and they're the ones that will add the sticky molecules to the serous secretion to turn it into a mucus. Right, and just to go over so that you're utterly familiar with the way in which these submucosal glands actually emerge onto the surface epithelium, let me draw another picture. So what will happen is this tube will go along in the direction coming into or out of the plane. Okay, so in this sort of direction, this tube will make its way along, and then eventually it will decide, actually, we need to empty out somewhere. So the mucus will fill up in the lumen down the middle, but it obviously does need to empty out onto the surface. So what will happen is the tube will dive through these inner layers of the bronchial wall. So it will go through the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, through the lamina propria, and then it will be continuous with the surface epithelium. So the way this will work is like so, if I draw a picture. So let's imagine I'm a little man sitting in the lumen of the bronchus here, looking at the bronchial epithelium. So let's say these are some bronchial epithelial cells here. So I'm seeing the tops of them, and they'd have cilia coming off the tops. What you might see is a submucosal gland emerging or continuing with the bronchial epithelium here, and you just see it as a tube like so, and the bronchial epithelial cells, they just sort of start to go down here rather than covering up the entrance. So this is how a submucosal gland would be continuous with the bronchial surface epithelium. It's effectively just like you've stuck your finger in there and pushed it out as though it was flexible. Imagine that it was elastic and you've pushed it out, pushed it through these layers, and then gone along in the plane of the submucosal layer to create a tube there. So these submucosal glands, truly they are continuous with the surface epithelium. The difference is that these epithelial cells, they don't have the cilia, but they retain the ability to create the serous secretion. You've got goblet cells amongst them, and those will produce the molecules which will turn the serous secretion into a mucus secretion. The lumen will fill up with mucus, and this mucus will gradually just push out onto the surface. And that's another major problem that occurs in cystic fibrosis. When the mucus is too thick and sticky, the submucosal glands just fill up, clog up completely with mucus, and it's just not moving through the submucosal glands at all. So the submucosal glands of people with cystic fibrosis just become completely clogged up with this really thick, sticky mucus. Okay, right, so there is the histology of a bronchus then. So I think next let's go on to the histology of a conducting bronchiole, and this is really very similar to what I've drawn already. Now, remember, conducting bronchioles are generation 11 to generation 16, and the big characteristic change that occurs between bronchi and bronchioles is that you lose the cartilaginous layer. So this cartilage layer is going to go. However, you also lose the submucosal layer, so you're no longer going to have the submucosal layer, and you're no longer going to have the submucosal glands. However, everything else remains the same. So really, to draw a picture of what a conducting bronchiole would look like, just take those outer two layers off and keep what is left, and that's what you'd have for a conducting bronchiole. For completeness and for revision, I am going to draw out a separate picture, but really it's not utterly necessary, but I will do this anyway. Okay, so this is going to be specifically a conducting bronchiole. The respiratory bronchioles are going to be even smaller. They're going to lack even more of the layers, so we'll deal with those separately. So now we're just doing conducting bronchiole. Okay, so what's the outer layer then going to be for the conducting bronchiole? Well, it's going to be the bronchial smooth muscle layer, or you could even call it bronchiolar smooth muscle cell layer now, since we are talking about a bronchiole rather than bronchi rather. So bronchiolar is the equivalent adjective to bronchial. It means pertaining to a bronchiole. Okay, so the bronchiolar smooth muscle cell layer then now. So I'll draw this like so. So the outermost layer will be bronchiolar smooth muscle. Now, you might have a bit of connective tissue surrounding that. So effectively, although you've lost the cartilage and you've lost the submucosal glands, you've still got a bit of the connective tissue that they were amongst, effectively, outside of the bronchiolar smooth muscle cells. But I'll just start with the bronchiolar smooth muscle cell there. So here it is, like so, and I will colour it in red. And once again, I'll stress that this layer consists of rings of smooth muscle cells, and those smooth muscle cells can contract, and when they all contract, they'll all shorten in length. And if you imagine them forming a great ring, and I might just draw a little picture of this. So here's one bronchiolar smooth muscle cell, here's another one, and you can see they're connecting up to form a ring, like so. If you can imagine them all contracting, then their lengths would all decrease. That means the circumference of that ring is going to decrease, and when the circumference of a ring decreases, the diameter of that ring decreases, so it will cause constriction of the lumen of the bronchiole. Indeed, it will cause bronchiolar constriction. Right, so there is the bronchiolar smooth muscle cell layer. Then what we're going to have is the lamina propria layer, and then the surface epithelium on top of that. Now the surface epithelium is still going to have the mucus on its surface, so the cilia are still going to have a layer of mucus over the top of them, and that mucus now is solely going to be produced by the surface epithelial cells. We've lost the submucosal glands, remember, so we don't have these specialized glands for producing mucus anymore. We're just going to rely on the surface epithelium to produce its own mucus, and I might even try and leave some cells without cilia, which can be our goblet cells this time. Better prepared. Okay, right, so here then this is going to be a goblet cell, and this one here is going to be a goblet cell. And of course the epithelium needs a basement membrane, so I'll just add that in here, like so. I'll also just add on the mucus layer to complete it up here. So these, on top of the cilia, we've got the mucus, which is still participating in the mucociliary escalator, so this is active right down to the conducting bronchioles. When we get to the tiny little respiratory bronchioles, that's the point where we're going to drop the mucociliary escalator, because we don't want mucus inside our actual alveoli, because we don't want to increase the diffusion distance for the gases that we want to exchange. We're going to have a different system inside alveoli for getting rid of any grit that gets in there or any bacteria that get in there, namely the alveolar macrophages, but we'll come to them when we come to them. Okay, so there then is the histology of the wall of a conducting bronchiole, and remember that is generation 11 to generation 16 or thereabouts. In the perfect world it is generation 11 to generation 16. Okay, so we'll have another break here, and in the next video we'll go over the histology of a respiratory bronchiole, the histology of alveoli and alveolar ducts, and then we'll talk about our lung volumes.